Now, in order to rebalance the world system, the Europeans produced colonies, and they produced colonies initially to extract wealth that had two fundamental bases at the very beginning. There were two main pillars to the colonial infrastructures that were installed in the New World. These were silver and slaves. Let's start with silver. This is an image of the Spanish doubloon, which one might say became the first world currency. The Spanish doubloon would show up in marketplaces in China, the Philippines, India, the west coast of Africa. It became, in a sense, the universal coin. But this was a coin made out of silver that was extracted from mines in the New World. Between 1493 and 1800, these centuries in which Spain and Portugal dominated the extraction of precious metals from the New World, 85% of the world's supply of silver came from the Americas. 85% of the world's supply of silver. And 70% of the world's supply of gold. So the discovery of the Americas created literally mother lodes of precious metals that could be extracted and used as currency for global transactions. This was the oil of the early modern world. And it created the fuel for transforming a world of villages where we started out in this course into the interdependent world economy that we now recognize as globalization. Now it's slow, it takes time, it's very uneven, but it is a very profound transformation. And silver was critical to making it work. The Americas, at its height, had as many as 30 active giant silver mines. The biggest of them were in Zacatecas, in Mexico, and Potosí, in the central Andes. Potosí. Perhaps the most legendary of all of these was the Cerro Rico, represented in this illustration. This is an illustration of the mountain under which would be a beehive of shafts that would be extracting silver from inside. To extract the silver, it was not just that the mountain contained with it these veins that could be tapped, but somebody had to do this work. And in order to make that function, the Europeans, the Spanish, relied upon a process of recruiting labor that was a tradition of the earlier Inca rulers of the mita system. This was a form of indentured labor that would be provided by villages on a seasonal or rotational basis to work in the mines. So the mita system was an inheritance of the old Inca era that the Spanish learned to deploy to extract silver, now to be pulled out of the Americas and shipped into the capillary systems of the global economy. Relying on local caciques, those local chieftains in villages, to determine which of the workers would go. And here you see a very good illustration of the labor process inside the giant shafts of the silver mines. So silver was one of the pillars of this system of extraction, and the reliance upon village governance arrangements was very important for delivering workers to the mines. The other pillar was slavery, the slave trade. For in creating colonies, as you can see in the case of the mines, Europeans also had to attach labor to the natural resources that they found in the Americas. part of the process of colonization is the peopling of the Americas. We now think of the ways in which Europeans colonized the Americas as the Europeanization of the New World, that European settlers came. This is a story that American history is often dominated by. We think of the Americas as the setting for European colonization. This is a fallacy. This is wrong. In fact, the majority of people who moved from the eastern side of the Atlantic to the western side of the Atlantic of the New World were not, in fact, Europeans. They were Africans. The vast majority of those who moved to the Americas initially were extracted from Africa. Between 1492 and 1776, 6.5 million people migrated from the Old World to the New and came from Africa. They came involuntarily, they were forced, they were coerced, as themselves commodities shipped aboard slave vessels that were especially designed to carry cargoes of human beings. This is a famous image of what's called the tumbeiro, which is the Portuguese slave vessel, and it gives you an example of the ways in which humans were packed like sardines into the holds of these vessels to be shipped from Africa for sale as commodities in the New World. 6.5 million, only 1 million of those were Europeans. 5.5 million people who moved from the Old World of Afro-Eurasia to the New World were in fact from Africa, and almost all of them were slaves. So colonization was a deeply coercive process. The total number of slaves shipped by the time the slave trade ended, from the time it began, the current estimates are between 10 and 12 million Africans were shipped to American shores. In fact, the traffic in Africans to the New World would only be eclipsed by the traffic and the movement of Europeans to the New World in the 1840s. Okay, I have a trick question for you, Valeria. What do you think happens in the 1840s that might tip the balance, that would allow Europeans to exceed the numbers of Africans?
There might be an end in the slave trade?
Absolutely. So and we're going to see this in a later lecture, the illegalization of the traffic of Africans. And remember the point that we made earlier about Las Casas and the idea that all humans are God's creatures and enjoy natural rights and we're not allowed to enslave them. That becomes a doctrine that's very important for fueling the abolitionist movement. You want to guess at another cause?
Instability within Europe?
Yes. And let's start in the 1840s, where the instability was the strongest. Ireland. It was the exodus of the Irish in the 1840s that would finally lead to the eclipse, the European eclipse of Africans. So, what's important for our purposes is that we must remember that these long process of creating colonies in the New World for the first few centuries was an Africanization of the New World. Most Africans came from West Africa, from the Congo, from Angola, and by the late 16th century, clearly hubbed, here, let's turn to this map, all up and down this coast, many of them drawing from the interior here. Now, where did they go? The map gives you a close indication. Many go to Brazil, the Caribbean, and North America. But the balance of this flow is important to understand. For 40% of the traffic went to Brazil alone. Another 30% of the traffic goes to the Caribbean. North America only imported 400,000 of the 12 million. 4%. 5% of the total. Fueling the exodus of Africans was a process of local warfare and rivalry within Africa itself. And it's important to note that the transaction of Africans moving to the New World began with the ways in which polities at war with neighbors in Africa captured slaves, captured warriors and families of rival polities, and initially did not necessarily capture them for chattel purposes. They captured them often for adoption, sometimes for sale and domestic service elsewhere. In fact, there was an important traffic of slaves, as I've mentioned in an earlier lecture, into the Indian Ocean. But as Europeans' appetite for the purchase of Africans took off, these chieftains along the coast of Africa soon discovered that enormous profits could be made that could fuel their conflicts with their rivals in Africa, and they soon began the business of capturing slaves on a large scale. It soon became a business that these polities could draw upon to harness resources, to buy weapons, to duke it out with their neighbors. African traders and princes played an important role as middlemen in this process and unleashed then the flow of slaves to the New World, leading to the Africanization of the Western Hemisphere. Now, it's important to note that the reason why Brazil, the Caribbean, and coastal North America were important is because it was precisely in those areas of the New World that the demographic catastrophe was the most profound. The indigenous people of the Caribbean were all but wiped out within the first century. Indians from the coastal littoral regions of Brazil retreated in the wake of the European arrival and penetration. So the population was replenished by the importation of African slaves. The other reason why African slaves were especially important for the coastal regions was not just to replace the disappearing peoples, but it was also there that Europeans implanted that institution that we've described in an earlier lecture, the plantation, especially for the production of sugar and later cotton. Sugar became a crucial element in the European diet. So, the old Brazil wood forests were in retreat. The Indians who lived with them were in retreat. And in their wake would be introduced the sugarcane and the slave. The result was a thriving African culture in lowlands of the Americas, especially in Brazil and the Caribbean. In fact, there would soon ensue a flow of Africans back to Africa and then from Africa back to Brazil and the Caribbean, constantly, and one might say, re-Africanizing many areas of the lowlands of the Caribbean and Brazil. And they would find sanctuary, this new form of re-Africanized cultures in the New World, especially in the fugitive slave societies. As slaves would flee the plantations, they often established towns, villages, in some cases large cities, as in the case of the city of Palmares in the late 17th century. And there they would create new cultures, new African belief systems as a hybrid combination of different African roots in the New World. This is an example of candomblé, which is a very popular religious African syncretic belief system in Brazil. So we see candomblé in Brazil, santeria in Cuba, voodoo in Haiti, that drew upon these African roots. But we should not lose sight of the fact that at the heart of it, the slave trade was a booming business. And labor, and the slave was above all a laborer. And we see, therefore, an elaborate network of production of agrarian staples for European consumption, like silver, based upon the importation of African labor to be deployed for the production of sugar in the New World. So turning a resource into commodity production. Labor was a commodity for purchase and sale, the slave. The sugar was a commodity for production and sale. Here we have the creation of colonies dedicated to the specialization of production for other people's consumption. Imported labor for the production of goods for export. Here you see a fundamental transformation then at the heart of the colonial enterprise. The compound effects would be to transform that old system of Arab-dominated trading on the Silk Roads, as silver and the commodities produced by slaves themselves being commodities, soon made their way, actually rather quickly made their way into the capillary structures of the global trading system. The effects on Africa, of course, were to transform Africa, once an important gold exporter, we've mentioned this in earlier lectures, soon becomes an exporter of people. And so the exporter of people would inject labor into the New World, shipped on tumbados for Brazil, where they would go into the production of sugar and also gold in the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil. And you begin to see the flow then beginning to reinforce itself. And commodities then traded further and further into the interior of Africa to extract slaves that could be shipped to Brazil, that could then be traded further into the interior of Brazil to extract the kinds of commodities that would be found. And so you see the penetration of this, let's call it, first globalization into the hinterlands of Africa and the Americas. This would, of course, shift the balance of powers within Africa itself, and the rise of new kingdoms, like the Congo kingdom, that would feed off the flow of humans and of gold outwards, and fuel the chronic warfare within Africa as they competed for territorial spoils. The result was a cycle of ratcheting up the process of extraction from Africa, the pushing of the slaving frontier ever further into the interior. So, while the New World was being conquered and colonized, and slavery was ramping up, so did the extraction of slaves from the interior of Africa. So that map of the first globalization is also can be read as a chart for the process of deepening violence. For what connected the Atlantic worlds together was not just institutions, not just the commercial arteries, but we might consider how there was, in a sense, a bridge of violence and of exploitation that also pulled the parts of the Atlantic world together.